It was a bright Tuesday morning at Atlanta International Airport. The sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the busy terminal as passengers hurried to their gates. Among them walked a distinguished military officer, her uniform crisp and decorated with medals that told stories of courage and service. She carried herself with quiet confidence, pulling her small carry-on bag while checking her boarding pass one more time. As she approached Gate B7, she could hear the usual announcements echoing through the speakers. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 247 to Washington, D.C., she stood up, gathered her belongings, and made her way to the line, ticket in hand. Her shoulders felt a bit heavy after the long ceremony where she'd received one of the military's highest honors, but her face showed no sign of fatigue. The line moved quickly, and soon she was walking down the jet bridge. As she stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard. May I help you find your seat?" "Thank you, I'm in 3A," she responded politely, showing her boarding pass. Just as she was about to reach her assigned seat, a man in an expensive gray suit looked up from his laptop. His face immediately changed, transforming from mild disinterest to obvious disapproval. He pressed the call button, his finger jabbing at it with unnecessary force. A different flight attendant quickly appeared. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" The man's voice carried deliberately loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. There must be some mistake. This person claims to be sitting in first class. He emphasized the word person in a way that made his prejudice clear, though he tried to mask it with fake concern. The flight attendant, a kind-faced woman with graying hair at her temples, glanced at the military officer's ticket. Other passengers began to turn in their seats, the atmosphere growing tense with each passing moment. "Sir," the flight attendant started professionally, "this passenger has a valid first-class ticket for seat 3A. The businessman's face reddened slightly. "Well, there must be some mix-up in the system. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never—" He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was crystal clear. The officer stood quietly, her expression calm but determined. Her hand rested lightly on the back of the empty seat, her seat, while around her, the other passengers watched the scene unfold. A young girl in the row behind whispered something to her mother, who shushed her while shooting an apologetic look toward the officer. The businessman wasn't finished. He shuffled through his briefcase, pulling out his own frequent flyer card. "Look, I'm a Platinum member. Surely you can sort this out. Perhaps there's seating available in the appropriate section." The flight attendant's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Sir, this passenger is a decorated military officer with a valid first-class ticket. There is no mistake to sort out." More passengers had started boarding now, creating a slight backup in the aisle. The officer could feel their stares, hear their whispers. But she'd faced far worse than this small-minded man. She'd led teams through combat zones, coordinated rescue missions under heavy fire, and saved countless lives. This moment, though uncomfortable, was just another chance to show grace under pressure. The businessman began to sputter about speaking to a supervisor, his face growing redder by the moment. But something interesting was happening around them. Other passengers in first class were starting to react. An elderly woman across the aisle removed her reading glasses and fixed the businessman with a disapproving stare. 2 rows up, another passenger, dressed in a business suit himself, shook his head in obvious disgust at the scene. The officer finally spoke, her voice steady and dignified. "I understand you're uncomfortable, sir. But I earned this seat just like I earned these medals. Now, if you'll excuse me." She slid gracefully into her seat, effectively ending the conversation. The flight attendant, clearly relieved, asked the officer if she'd like a pre-flight beverage. The businessman sat in stunned silence, his complaints dying on his lips as he noticed the increasingly hostile glares from fellow passengers. As the rest of the plane boarded, a quiet buzz of conversation filled the cabin. Several passengers made a point to thank the officer for her service as they passed by. The businessman buried his face in his laptop, but everyone could see the shame beginning to creep across his features. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of a story that would change not just these 2 people's lives, but would ripple out to touch countless others. The real test of character, and the opportunity for redemption, was still to come. As the plane prepared for takeoff, The tension in first class remained thick enough to cut with a knife. The flight attendant, a woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle demeanor, moved through the cabin with practiced ease, trying her best to diffuse the uncomfortable situation. "Would you like some water or orange juice?" she asked the military officer, making sure her voice carried just enough to show other passengers that this decorated service member would receive the same first-class treatment as everyone else. "Water would be lovely, thank you," the officer replied with a genuine smile. Her voice was steady and professional, showing no sign of the hurt that must have come from such a public display of prejudice. She'd learned long ago that maintaining dignity in difficult moments wasn't just about personal pride, it was about representing something bigger than herself. The businessman, still visibly flustered, kept his eyes glued to his laptop screen, aggressively typing what looked like an email. His fingers stabbed at the keys with unnecessary force, betraying his continued agitation. Every few minutes, he would shoot sideways glances at the officer, as if her mere presence offended him. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked past on her way to the bathroom. She stopped briefly, her eyes wide with admiration as she looked at the officer's medals. "Are you a hero?" she asked innocently before her mother gently ushered her along. The officer's face softened as she answered, "I just work with heroes, sweetie." Her response carried through the cabin, and several passengers smiled. The businessman's typing suddenly got even louder. The plane took off, climbing into the cloudy morning sky. As they reached cruising altitude, more passengers began to show their support in subtle ways. An elderly gentleman across the aisle asked the officer about one of her medals, genuinely interested in her service. A young woman in a business suit made a point of nodding respectfully when their eyes met. The flight attendant returned with warm towels, starting with the officer's row. The businessman practically snatched his towel, muttering under his breath about standards these days. But his comments weren't as quiet as he thought. A distinguished-looking woman 2 rows ahead turned around, her silver hair framing a face that had clearly seen enough of life to know better. "Young man," she said firmly though not unkindly, "I suggest you remember where you are and who helps keep you free to sit here complaining." The businessman's face flushed red again, but this time with obvious embarrassment. Other passengers nodded in agreement with the older woman's words. He loosened his tie slightly, beginning to look uncomfortable for a different reason now. The officer maintained her composure throughout all of this, neither encouraging nor discouraging the other passengers' reactions. Instead, she pulled out a book about military medicine, its pages marked with colored tabs, and began to read quietly. A couple of rows back, 2 other passengers were whispering about the situation. "Can you believe his behavior?" one asked. "In this day and age?" "My grandfather was in the military," the other replied. "He always said you can tell a person's true character by how they treat others when they think they have power over them." The flight attendant continued her rounds, professionally handling the increasing tension. She'd seen all sorts of behavior in her years of flying, but something about this situation felt different. There was a lesson unfolding here, though none of them knew yet just how important that lesson would become. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the businessman's typing gradually slowed. He seemed to be running out of steam, perhaps finally sensing how his behavior was being received by those around him. Every now and then, he would glance at the officer's medals, then quickly look away when someone caught him doing it. The officer, meanwhile, remained focused on her book, making occasional notes in the margins. Her calm demeanor served as a sharp contrast to the businessman's agitation. A younger passenger nearby watched this dynamic with obvious interest, clearly taking mental notes on how to handle difficult situations with grace. The smell of breakfast began wafting through the cabin as the flight attendants prepared the morning meal service. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps realizing he'd soon have to interact directly with the officer as they were served their meals. Little did anyone know that this uncomfortable breakfast service would be the least of their concerns. The real test of character, for everyone on that flight, was about to begin, and it would reveal far more about human nature than anyone could have expected. As the flight settled into its rhythm, a friendly-looking man in his mid-60s sat next to the military officer. He wore a worn veteran's cap and had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. After a polite nod of acknowledgement, he couldn't help but notice the Distinguished Service Medal among her decorations. "That's quite an honor you've got there," he said warmly, gesturing to the medal. "Don't see many of those." The officer smiled, marking her place in her book before turning to him. "Thank you, sir. Just received it yesterday, actually." The conversation drew the attention of nearby passengers, including a few who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. The businessman pretended to be absorbed in his laptop, but his typing had slowed considerably and his head was slightly tilted toward their conversation. "I'd love to hear the story behind it, if you don't mind sharing," the veteran said. "I served myself back in the day, though nothing as impressive as what you've done." The officer's eyes softened with respect for her fellow service member. "Every service is impressive, sir. But this medal, it belongs to my whole team, really." She began to tell the story, her voice carrying quietly through the first-class cabin. She spoke of a remote medical facility in a conflict zone where her team had been stationed. One night, they received word that a village had been caught in crossfire, with numerous civilians injured, including many children. The weather was terrible, she explained, her voice taking on a distant quality as she remembered. Dust storms, zero visibility. Nobody was supposed to fly that night. The veteran nodded knowingly, while other passengers found themselves leaning in slightly to hear better. Even the flight attendant slowed her pace as she passed by, caught up in the story. "But my father always taught me that service means putting others first. He was one of the first black helicopter pilots in his unit, flew rescue missions in some of the worst conditions imaginable. He used to say, 'When others run from danger, we run toward it.'" She described how they'd launched a series of dangerous evacuation missions, flying through conditions that would have grounded most aircraft. Her team worked for 36 hours straight, coordinating with ground units, navigating through hostile territory, and bringing injured civilians to safety. "We lost radio contact several times," she continued. "Navigation systems were barely working. We were flying almost blind, using old-school techniques my father had taught me. But we couldn't stop. There were children waiting for help." The businessman had completely stopped typing now, his screen dimming from inactivity. Other passengers had abandoned any pretense of not listening, completely absorbed in the story. "In the end, we evacuated 47 civilians, including 16 children. Our medical team performed emergency surgeries in the helicopter. Every single person survived." The veteran wiped a tear from his eye, not even trying to hide his emotion. "Your father must be incredibly proud," he said softly. A shadow passed over the officer's face. "He would have been. He passed away last year, but not before teaching me everything he knew about service, dignity, and doing what's right, no matter how others treat you." The businessman's laptop closed with a quiet click. His hands were trembling slightly. The officer continued, sharing more about her father's legacy. She spoke about growing up on military bases, watching him face discrimination with unwavering dignity. She described how he turned every challenge into a teaching moment, showing her that true strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. "That's why I became a medical officer," she explained. "Dad always said the greatest honor isn't in receiving respect, but in being worthy of it. Every life we save, every person we help, that's his legacy living on." As she finished speaking, the cabin had fallen completely silent. The flight attendant had tears in her eyes, and several passengers were nodding thoughtfully. The businessman stared straight ahead, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked very much like shame. Little did anyone know that this moment of shared humanity would become crucial in the events that were about to unfold. The lessons of service, sacrifice, and dignity were about to be put to the ultimate test, and everyone on that flight would soon understand exactly what the officer's father had meant about running toward danger when others run away. The flight continued through patches of turbulence, the plane occasionally shuddering as it pushed through clouds. The businessman had grown increasingly agitated, but not for the same reasons as before. His earlier prejudice seemed to be giving way to something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps shame, or maybe both. He'd already pressed the call button 3 times in the past hour, each time making increasingly desperate attempts to switch seats. Surely there must be something available in business class. He'd asked the flight attendant, his voice having lost its earlier arrogance. "I'd even take economy at this point." The flight attendant remained professionally firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're at full capacity. You'll need to remain in your assigned seat." Each time she said this, Her eyes would briefly meet those of other passengers who had been watching these exchanges with increasing interest. The officer maintained her dignified composure throughout these interruptions, engaging in quiet conversation with the veteran beside her. They discussed changes in military medicine over the years, their voices low but carrying just enough for nearby passengers to catch fascinating snippets about battlefield innovations and emergency procedures. A woman across the aisle, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up. "I'm a nurse at City General," she said, leaning slightly forward. "The techniques you're describing, they've revolutionized our trauma care procedures." The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his collar seeming to grow tighter with each passing minute. He loosened his tie again, pulled out his phone, and began scrolling through what appeared to be news articles about military medical achievements. More passengers joined the conversation, creating an impromptu community in the first-class cabin. A teacher mentioned how she used military success stories to inspire her students. A business executive shared how military leadership principles had transformed his company culture. The businessman's discomfort grew more visible. He kept glancing at the officer's medals, then at his own reflection in his darkened phone screen. His face had taken on a slight sheen of sweat, though the cabin temperature was perfectly comfortable. "I need to use the restroom," he announced suddenly, standing up abruptly. As he did, several items fell from his lap: his phone, a magazine, and a small bottle of prescription medication that rolled under the seat in front of him. The officer noticed his hands shaking as he tried to gather his belongings. The businessman's face had grown pale, and his breathing seemed slightly labored. But pride kept him from meeting anyone's eyes as he hurriedly made his way to the bathroom. "He doesn't look well," whispered the veteran to the officer. Other passengers had noticed too. The flight attendant watched the businessman's unsteady walk with concern, making a mental note to check on him when he returned. The conversation in the cabin continued, but now with an undercurrent of worry. The officer kept glancing toward the bathroom, her medical training causing her to notice things others might miss: the businessman's unsteady gait, his shallow breathing, the slight gray tinge to his skin before he'd stood up. "How long has he been in there?" someone asked after several minutes had passed. The flight attendant approached the bathroom door and knocked gently. "Sir, are you all right?" There was no response. The tension in the cabin shifted from social discomfort to genuine concern. The officer sat forward slightly, her hands unconsciously moving to unfasten her seatbelt. Years of emergency medical training had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending crisis. The flight attendant knocked again, louder this time. "Sir, I need you to respond, or I'll have to open the door to check on you." Silence. And then, from behind the door, came the muffled sound of something, or someone falling. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The officer's earlier story about running toward danger when others run away was about to be put to the test. None of them knew it yet, but the next few minutes would change not just the businessman's life, but the lives of everyone watching this scene unfold. The real crisis was just beginning, and the true test of character, for everyone involved, was about to reveal itself in ways none of them could have anticipated. The sound of the fall echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap. Without hesitation, the military officer was on her feet, moving with the quick precision that came from years of emergency response training. "I'm a combat medic," she announced to the flight attendant. "We need to get that door open now." The flight attendant quickly retrieved the emergency key. As the door swung open, they found the businessman collapsed on the floor, his face ashen and his breathing shallow. The officer immediately dropped to her knees beside him, her earlier medal ceremony uniform now pressed against the bathroom floor as she checked his vital signs. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called out firmly, checking his pulse. It was rapid and irregular. His skin felt clammy to the touch. Years of battlefield medicine told her these weren't good signs. "I need the emergency medical kit and the AED," she called out, her voice calm but commanding. "And please contact the ground for an emergency landing clearance." The cabin burst into controlled chaos. Flight attendants rushed to retrieve medical supplies, while passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. The veteran who had been sitting next to the officer stepped up to help, his own military training kicking in. "He's having a heart attack," the officer announced, her hands moving swiftly to loosen his tie and unbutton his collar. I saw the warning signs earlier but didn't want to assume. The businessman's eyes fluttered open briefly. Recognition crossed his face as he saw who was helping him, followed by what looked like shame. He tried to speak but couldn't form the words. "Don't try to talk," the officer said gently. "Just focus on breathing. I've got you." The flight attendant returned with the medical kit and AED. The officer worked quickly, attaching the monitoring pads to the businessman's chest while explaining each step to him in a calm, reassuring voice. The same man who had tried to have her removed from first class was now literally putting his life in her hands. "The pilot has begun emergency descent procedures," the flight attendant reported. "We're about 20 minutes from the nearest airport." "We need to move him to a flat surface," the officer decided. The veteran and 2 other male passengers stepped forward to help. Together, they carefully carried the businessman to a clear area near the galley. The businessman's eyes were full of fear, but also something else, regret. He managed to grasp the officer's hand weakly. She squeezed back reassuringly. "I know what you're thinking, and it doesn't matter right now. Just stay with me." A nurse who had been sitting across the aisle joined them, offering her assistance. Together, they monitored his vital signs while the officer administered emergency first aid. The businessman's eyes never left the officer's face, as if trying to memorize the features of the person he had so quickly judged and dismissed just hours before. The plane hit some turbulence during the descent, making their task more challenging. The officer stayed steady, her hands never wavering as she continued treatment. She spoke continuously to the businessman, her voice firm but kind, keeping him focused and conscious. "My father," the businessman suddenly gasped out, his voice barely a whisper. "He was wrong. Taught me wrong." "Save your strength," the officer replied softly. "We can talk about all of that later." The cabin felt heavy with emotion as passengers watched the scene unfold. Here was a man who had shown such prejudice now being saved by the very person he had discriminated against. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the businessman himself. 5 minutes to landing, the pilot announced over the intercom, "Emergency services are standing by." The businessman's condition had stabilized somewhat thanks to the officer's quick action and expertise. But he wasn't out of danger yet. As the plane began its final descent, the officer held his hand firmly, monitoring his pulse with her other hand. "You're doing great," she encouraged him. "Just a few more minutes. You can tell me all about how wrong your father was once we get you to the hospital." A weak smile flickered across the businessman's face, even as tears rolled down his cheeks. The entire cabin seemed to be holding its breath, united in hoping for his survival, not just for his sake, but for the chance at redemption his story now represented. The plane touched down with a jolt, and emergency vehicles could be seen racing toward them on the runway. As paramedics rushed aboard, the officer gave them a precise, professional report of everything she'd done and observed. The businessman refused to let go of her hand until she promised to visit him in the hospital. As they wheeled him off the plane, the cabin burst into applause, not just for the save, but for the powerful lesson in humanity they had all witnessed. The officer simply returned to her seat, straightened her uniform, and began gathering her things, as if saving the life of someone who had shown her nothing but prejudice was just another day's work. But this story was far from over. The real transformation, and the note that would touch hearts across the country, was still to come. The emergency landing field was a buzz of activity. As paramedics wheeled the businessman toward the waiting ambulance, he kept trying to speak. His voice was weak, but his eyes were filled with an urgent need to communicate something. "Paper," he managed to whisper to one of the flight attendants who had come to help with his belongings. "Please, I need paper." The flight attendant quickly found a notepad and pen in her uniform pocket. With trembling hands, the businessman began to write. His usually pristine handwriting was shaky but determined. Everyone could see how much effort each word cost him, yet he kept writing, pausing only when the paramedics needed to check his vital signs. The officer had stayed nearby, helping coordinate with the emergency response team and providing them with details about the treatment she'd given during the flight. She hadn't noticed the businessman writing, focused instead on ensuring he would get the best possible care. When he finally finished the note, the businessman pressed it into the flight attendant's hands. "Give this to her," he whispered, his eyes moving toward the officer. "Please, she needs to know." The paramedics were ready to transport him now. As they lifted him into the ambulance, the flight attendant approached the officer, still holding the folded piece of paper. "He insisted you should have this," she said softly. The officer took the note, but didn't open it immediately. Around her, passengers were being arranged for transfer to another flight that would take them to their final destination. Many were still talking about what they'd witnessed, their voices filled with awe and reflection. Finally, standing in a quiet corner of the emergency field, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unsteady, but the words were crystal clear. To the officer I roamed. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand something. Today, you didn't just save my life, you saved my soul." I was raised with prejudices I never questioned. My father taught me to judge people by their appearance, and I carried that poison in my heart for 60 years. I thought I was better than others because of my money, my status, my position in life. But today, when my life hung by a thread, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the compassion and skill of someone I had treated with contempt just hours before. You could have let someone else help me. Nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you showed me what true character looks like. You demonstrated more dignity, professionalism, and humanity in those few minutes than I have shown in my entire life. The shame I feel is overwhelming, but for the first time, it's leading to real change. If I survive this, I promise you that my life will be different. Your father taught you to run toward danger. My father taught me to run toward hatred. Today, you showed me a better path. I don't know if I'll make it through this, but I needed you to know you didn't just restart my heart today, you opened my eyes. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Thank you for being bigger than my prejudice. If I survive, I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of the second chance you've given me. Your father would be proud of the lesson you taught today, not through words, but through actions. With deepest respect and endless gratitude. A changed man. The officer stood quietly, reading the note several times. Other passengers who had been nearby could see tears in her eyes, though her posture remained as straight and dignified as ever. The flight attendant who had delivered the note was crying openly, having read it over the officer's shoulder. The veteran who had sat next to her during the flight approached gently. "Are you all right?" he asked, noticing her emotion. She carefully folded the note and placed it in her uniform pocket, right next to her heart. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "my father always said that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, they're won in human hearts." As the replacement aircraft prepared for boarding, word of the note's contents began to spread among the passengers. Something profound had happened on that flight, something that went far beyond a simple medical emergency. They had witnessed a transformation that many had believed impossible, the moment when a lifetime of prejudice gave way to genuine understanding. The businessman's condition was stable as the ambulance pulled away, its sirens silent now. But the real healing, the kind that happens in the human heart, had only just begun. And the note he'd written would soon touch far more lives than anyone could have imagined. 6 months had passed since that eventful flight. The local hospital's recovery wing was bright with morning sunlight as the businessman stood at the podium, addressing a room full of people. He looked different now, healthier, yes, but the change went deeper than that. His eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before, and his posture spoke of humility rather than arrogance. "When I woke up in this hospital half a year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was a different person, not just because I'd survived a heart attack, but because someone taught me the greatest lesson of my life." The audience listened intently. Among them sat the military officer, now wearing the rank of major after a recent promotion. She sat quietly in the front row, watching the man she'd saved tell their story. "I was raised to judge people by their appearance," the businessman continued. "I spent 60 years looking down on others, thinking my wealth and position made me better. Then, at 35,000 feet, life decided to teach me how wrong I was." He described that day on the plane, not sparing himself any embarrassment as he recalled his terrible behavior. "I tried to have this officer removed from first class simply because of how she looked. Hours later, she saved my life without a moment's hesitation." The businessman's voice cracked with emotion as he gestured to the large check displayed on an easel beside him. "That's why today, I'm donating $5 million to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in emergency medicine. It will be named in honor of this officer's father, who taught her that true service means running toward danger when others run away. The audience broke into applause. In the months since his heart attack, the businessman had become a changed man. He retired from his corporate position to focus full-time on philanthropy, particularly supporting military families and promoting diversity in medical education. But that's not all, he continued, once the applause died down. This hospital's emergency response team is getting new equipment. Every ambulance will be fitted with the latest life-saving technology. Because sometimes seconds matter. Sometimes those seconds give people like me a chance to become better. He turned to face the officer directly now. You didn't just restart my heart that day, you gave me a new one. A better one. One that finally sees people for who they are, not what they look like. The officer's eyes glistened with tears, but her smile was bright. In the months since the incident, she'd been promoted and had started working with the businessman to develop training programs that combined military emergency response techniques with civilian medical care. Their story had spread far beyond that initial flight. News channels had picked it up, social media had shared it widely, and it had become a powerful example of how prejudice could be overcome through actions rather than arguments. The businessman stepped down from the podium, walking over to where the officer sat. Without hesitation, he hugged her, something the old version of him would never have done. The audience stood and applauded, many wiping away tears. Later, at the reception, other passengers from that flight showed up to reunite with them. The veteran who had sat next to the officer was there. So was the flight attendant who had delivered the note. Each had their own story about how that day had changed their perspective. I use your story in my classroom now, the teacher from the flight told them. It teaches more about human dignity than any textbook ever could. The businessman reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper, the original note he'd written in those desperate moments after his heart attack. He'd had it framed for the officer as a gift, along with her father's military photo that she'd shared with him. Your father was right, he told her, his voice thick with emotion. The greatest honor isn't in receiving respect, but in being worthy of it. I'm still working on being worthy of what you did for me that day. The officer took the framed note, running her fingers gently over the glass. My father would say you already are, she replied softly. Because you didn't just learn from your mistake, you're working to make sure others don't make the same one. As they stood together, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, they represented something powerful. Proof that hate could be transformed into understanding, that prejudice could give way to respect, and that sometimes the greatest journeys don't involve physical distance at all, but the distance a human heart can travel when given the chance to change. The businessman's heart attack hadn't just saved his life, it had given him a new way of living it. And their story continued to inspire others, showing that even in our most divided times, compassion and dignity could build bridges that prejudice had failed to burn.